Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to the first lecture of the course on education and neurosciences. In this course, we will describe to you the neurosciences research that will help you in the education and learning processes. That how actually the learning happens in the brain, what structures of the brains are involved, how the informations are processed in the brain, and so on. So in this first lecture, we will describe the brain structure and the function. And myself, Dr. Aftab Ahmad, I am serving as President of National Academy of Young Scientists, founder of Research and Innovation Club, and my email address is given. If you have any questions, you can surely ask me, and I will be happy to answer. This is a very important lecture because initially, if you have to understand the educational neurosciences, it's very important to learn about the brain structure and the functions, what regions are involved in what kind of behavior or what type of other our emotions and so on. So it's very important to understand the structure and the function. And the brain is covered by the skull that is outside the bony structure, and inside the skull is the brain. And now we will learn in detail the structures of the brain. So brain regions are classified into two categories. Old brain, or the primitive structure. This is the structure actually which is evolved along the history from the animals and so on. So these are the structure which are present even in the animals, and this is called the primitive structure. And the limbic system, we will describe this in detail in our coming slides. And now we are going towards the brain. The brain is an amazing 3-pound organ that control all functions of the body. You are very much aware that the brain is actually controlling everything, whatever we are, what information we sense, we dream, our memory, our movement, everything is controlled by the brain. Actually, the brain makes sense for all the information that we are receiving. The information through sound, it makes sense of the sounds, it differentiates different sounds. So it has a very complex, this is the most complex organ in the human body, because although it's not that big, it's just around 1300 to 1400 grams, so 1.3 or 1.4 kg is the weight of the brain, the total brain, but it controls every functions of the body. If even we talk about the energy, it's just 2% of our body weight. So we compare the whole body weight is just 2%, but it consumes 20 to 25% of our energy. So you can imagine from here how much energy is required for the brain to function, because it's controlling so much functions, it controlling everything. So it needs a lot of more energy in our body to functions properly. And somebody, if you are very deficient in your energy, if you are not eating any and you become unconscious, it's only because brain need a lot of energy to work, and brain, some part of the brain, they shut down and person become unconscious. So this is very important to learn that how the brain functions, and as I mentioned, that it need a lot of energy to function. And so it interprets information from the outside world and embodies the essence of the mind and soul. Intelligence, creativity, emotions, and memory are the few things that are governed by the brain. So everything is actually controlled by the brain. So every whatever gesture we do, whatever information we interpret, even we can imagine about somebody is narrating you a story. He is telling you that he has a beautiful journey of to the northern areas of Pakistan. He has visited Lake Saif al-Muluk, and he been to Babu Sar Top and so on. And your brain actually, you are not there, but brain is making sense of the brain is moving in that direction. So it actually makes sense of the information. So if somebody is telling you that there was a huge lake, so their brain actually will make an image of the lake and how it could be, and the mountains and the glaciers and the snowfall and so on. So it makes actually, so this is a very strong behavior, and very strong imaginary functions that are done by the brain. So brain is really, really complex in this perspective. These are the external features of the brain. The brain mainly is covered by the main mass is by the cerebrum. Cerebrum is the main, like the bigger portion of the brain. So cerebrum is there. We will discuss this in detail. And then there is a brainstem. Brainstem is actually, this is what we have the proto-primitive brain structure. So it has evolved during the evolution process. It is also there in the animals, it's there in the human. And there is cerebellum, the hind brain, that is at the very back. So cerebrum is almost, it covers the whole brain. And then at the very base of this cerebrum is the brain stem, and then at the very back, at this point, is the hind brain or the cerebellum, and we will describe this in detail. So these are and now we will going to discuss about the cerebrum. Cerebrum makes up 75% of our brain's volume, so it's the major portion of our brain, and it's 85% of its weight. So it's as he mentioned, that is the major portion of the brain is the cerebrum. It is split into two hemispheres, left and right. That's why there is a very common terminology is being used that either you are left brain or the right brain person. So actually, it's the brain is the cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres, the left and the right hemisphere. And this is, if you open the brain, then you can realize the structure of during your either as how we have might seen the brain when it is like the brain is taken out from the cows or the goats and the sheep and so on. So this is actually the two hemispheres are there, the right and the left, and they are divided by the longitudinal fissure. So there is actually interconnection between the two hemispheres. There is a lot of connections are being there. The cerebrum is covered by a sheath of neural tissue called the cerebral cortex or neurocortex. So this is covered by a sheath, and below the sheath is the cerebrospinal fluid that actually passes the brain. And it's very. We will also discuss that how it actually washes the brain and how important it is for the brain health. So cerebrum, we were discussing, cerebrum is the major portion of the brain. It's 75% of the brain volume, and it is divided into two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and that is connected by the longitudinal fissure. And it is covered by a sheath that is called the cerebral cortex or the neocortex. And in this slide, we will discuss different lobes of the brain. And they are actually mainly divided on the basis of, this is the lecture in which we'll describe the structure and the function relation. So if we talk about the brain lobe, then there is a frontal lobe, as you can see, the very front portion of the brain, that is called the frontal lobe. This is called the higher center of the brain. Higher center of the brain because it's involved in decision making, planning, reasoning, consciousness of emotions. So this is very important. Whatever decision you are making, if you are reason about the things, whether we should go for it, whether we shouldn't go for it, whether we should buy a house, whether should I buy a car, or so on. So it actually makes the reasoning. It's involved in the planning. It is involved in the decision, and this is very important. And this is actually the portion of the brain which is enlarged in human. That's why we are the human, and we have the superior behavior, and we have the planning. And as you can see that the other, like even there are the animals which have the bigger brain than us, like the elephant or the whale, for example. They have the much bigger brain, but they have very little frontal lobe, which is involved in planning and decision making. Although they have the bigger brain, but yet they don't build the houses or the other structure, other behavior that is by the human. This is only by the human. So this lobe is very important, and this is called the frontal lobe. And then there is occipital, as you can realize from the name. The occipital is actually involved in the vision. It is at the very back. So eyes are there, but the information which are relevant to the vision are at the very back side of the brain. That is called the occipital lobe. You can see over here, this is the occipital lobe. This is called the visual center of the brain, the visual cortex. So it's involved in the vision. It's concerned with processing information from the eyes, vision, color, shape, and perspective. So it's involved. All things that are related to our vision are controlled by the occipital lobe. So that is at the very back side. Then there is here at the very top of the brain, at this portion is the parietal lobe. So parietal lobe is involved with the orientation, our movement, sensation, calculation, sometime of recognition and memory. And these are actually the features that are covered by the parietal lobe. And then there is a temporal lobe, as you can guess from the name, is involved with the hearing. So our ears are there. So this region of the brain is mainly, as you can see over here, is involved in the hearing process is called the temporal lobe, the hearing center of the brain, concerned with processes, auditory information, hearing, sound recognition, and speech. So these are the portions. So let me explain to you at this point that each portion of our brain is involved in specific functions, and we will discuss this in detail in the future slides and also in the future lectures, that each portion of the brain. And from this lecture, we will actually learn that how we can increase the connectedness between different parts of the brain, and how we can involve our, for example, frontal lobe more in the decision making processes and so on. So this will be really interesting for all of you. Now we are going to discuss briefly about the cerebellum, as we have initially talked about the cerebrum. So cerebrum is, as I mentioned, is the major portion of the brain. At the very back side is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is at the very end. It is, the structure is a bit different than the cerebrum. As you can see over here, it's like the walnut like structure as you have seen inside, but this structure is a bit different, as you can see over here. This is called the cerebellum. So cerebellum is only 1/8 the size of the cerebrum. And how much functions there? It is involved mainly about the controlling of our balance and movement. And you might have seen that if somebody is hit here very hard, then they lose their balance and movement, and they just fell down. So this is very important structure, which is at the very back side of our brain, is called the cerebellum. So it is involved with the coordination, balance, and movement, breathing, digestion, the circulation of blood around the body, receiving information from the primary motor cortex and muscles and joints. So it's mainly involved in the coordination, movement, and balance. So these are the major functions which are controlled by the cerebellum, which is a smaller portion. That is also called the hindbrain, because it is at the very back side of the brain. Now we are going to discuss about the midbrain, the brain junction. So we are going to talk about the midbrain, the brain junction. So midbrain is actually briefly, this is the midbrain of the structure. So it collects all the information, and it send the information to specific portion of the brain, as we have discussed in initial part. So it's relay information to the cerebral hemisphere. So wherever the information should go, it send them. So initially the information comes to the brain junction or the midbrain. It makes sense of the information, that where it should go. Either it should go to the planning center of the brain, it should go to the sensation, it should go to the memory, it should go to the coordination, and so on. So it relays information to the specific portion of the brain. So it relays information to the cerebral hemispheres. It oral information to the temporal lobe, and visual information to the occipital lobe. So it sends our temporal lobe, it sends the information that are coming from our ears. So it goes to the midbrain, and then it goes to the temporal lobe. The information which are coming from our eyes, it goes back to the midbrain, and from there they are projected to the occipital lobe. So it goes from midbrain. So it makes sense of the information, and then it sends the information to the relevant portion, and it happens in milliseconds. It's very fast information, and we'll discuss that how the neurons are actually working and how the connections are being done. So this is also very important to learn that what functions are there. And then there is very important structure that is called medulla oblongata. So medulla oblongata is at the very base of the brain. As you can see over here, here it is the medulla, and it is involved in unconscious processes. There are some processes in our body which are being done, either we are involved in that or not. So for example, we can't control to our heart rate. To some extent we can control our breathing, but it's mainly if we don't control, breathing is happening and the blood pressure is there. So these are the functions which are controlled by the medulla. These are controlled by the uh, brain stems. These are the structure, the primitive brain, which control all these functions. And then there is a brain stem. Here it is the structure, the forebrain that is there, our frontal lobe, and then there is a midbrain which makes sense of the information. Then there are pons, medulla, and the spinal cord. Spinal cord is getting information from the whole body, and they are projecting information to the specific portion of the brain. So the brainstem connects the rest of the brain to the spinal cord, and it has role in cardiovascular system control. So it is involved in cardiovascular system, respiratory control, pain sensitivity control, alertness, and consciousness. So this is actually the primitive brain, which involved with alertness, pain, respiratory control, cardiovascular system control, is control of blood pressure, and so on. So these are the functions which are important for any life. So these are the unconsciously controlled functions of the brain, which are there in the animals, which are there in the humans. But there are certain features which are specific to the human, just like we have mentioned that our frontal lobe is involved in the planning and the decision making and so on. So that is actually the unique portion of the brain. But these are the brain portion which are also varying because they are collecting the information and making sense, and then receiving the messages from specific portion of the brain and relays back to the body. So this is the two-way processes that is happening in our body. So brain stem is actually at the base of the brain, at the very base, and then it connects to the spinal cord uh, at the very back side. So it is involved in different functions as he had mentioned. And then there is a thalamus. Thalamus is at the very center of the brain. This is responsible for routing all of the sensory information to the correct part of the brain via the axon or the white matter. So a thalamus is a part of the brain which is actually collecting the information, which is collecting all the sensory information. That is our touch, sense of touch, hearing, our visual, whatever senses are involved. So they are actually coming to the thalamus, and the thalamus projects those information to the specific portion of the brain. So this is mainly, thalamus is a part of the brain that you should remember, which is involved in collecting all the sensory information are coming to the thalamus, and then it sends the information to the relevant, whether to occipital lobe or the temporal lobe or parietal lobe or the uh, frontal lobe. So it actually is the main point which collects the information, the sensory information. And then we are going to talk about the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus, you might have learned about it during your physiology classes, but this is the portion of the brain. So here is the thalamus, and then there is a very small portion which is called the hypothalamus. So this portion is the hypothalamus, which is connected to the thalamus. So it contains the thermoregulatory center, monitor core body and skin temperature, initiates negative feedback response to restore body to optimum temperature. So it's very important role of controlling the body temperature, and it's very important function because we are moving to different temperatures. Sometimes we are going towards a very hot area, sometimes we go to a very cold area, and this is part of the brain which is involved in controlling the body temperature. So thalamus, as you mentioned, is mainly involved in the sensory information, but the hypothalamus is involved with the information that controls the body temperature. So it's constantly sense the body temperature, the whole body temperature, and then maintain the body temperature. And it also acts as endocrine gland that secretes the hormone. You are very much familiar about it, that there are hypothalamus is actually the a gland in the brain that secretes the hormone, and it's involved in different functions that we'll discuss in later portion. So the hypothalamus is involved with the body temperatures, and also it secretes the hormones in the body. Then we are going to talk about the hippocampus. Hippocampus is there. It is also connected to the thalamus, and this is the portion which is called the hippocampus. So it's involved in, actually hippocampus is involved in the memory and the facts. So all the information, and so which are actually coming, which are related to our memory, whether they are very old memory or a new memory, are the facts and the places and wherever you have gone in your life. So these are actually are controlled by the hippocampus. So it's involved in long-term memory, such as facts that you also remember during your classes, like during my matriculation, what poems I have read and what subjects I was reading. So these are the facts, and the events, like some of the football matches or cricket matches, and the faces you have met maybe during your early life and the later life, and then the places where you have gone. So it's actually, it makes sense of all the memory related things. And it, if you have to recall some memory, if you have recalled some person, our hippocampus is involved in that process, and it's actually store the information. It's help in storing the facts and the information, and it makes sense of those information whenever we have to make sense. So it actually gets the information, goes sent to the frontal lobe when you are involved in decision making. So this is also very important organ of the brain. So the limbic system, as we were talking in the initial slides, there are two: primitive brain and the limbic system. The limbic system, the term limbic system means the entire neuronal circuitry that controls emotions, emotional behavior, and motivational drive. So it's the whole brain circus that control our behavior and the emotions. So this is actually a unique characteristics of the human, that they have a very complex behavior and they have very complex motivational drives. So with this information, I have talked about some of the organs already. Like I have talked about the thalamus, that it actually involved in the sensory information, and it collects the sensory information and relays to the specific portion of the brain. Hippocampus, we have learned that this is involved in the memory, and especially the long-term memory about the facts, events, faces, and places. And we also have learned about the hypothalamus that controls the body temperature, and also it secretes the hormone. We haven't talked about the amygdala. Amygdala is very, very important structure because it's related to our emotions. So this is the portion which is involved in all the emotional behavior. And during our teenagers, this is the part of the brain which is, I'm sorry, this is the part of the brain which is very active. That's why during the teenagers, we show a lot of emotional behavior. So amygdala, which is here, is a very tiny structure. Amygdala is highly processed sensory input, responsible for learning and maintenance of link between the stimulus and its emotional value. So we will talk in detail about this amygdala, but this is the emotional center of the brain. So whatever emotions are related, it goes and it makes sense to those emotions. And if you are a very emotional person, so this is the region of the brain which is mainly involved. So there is always a fight between the emotional center and the decision making center, the frontal lobe of the brain. So we will discuss that, how it affects our behavior. So these are different regions of the brain, and we, as I mentioned, that we have talked about some of the portions, and we were, so this is a very like an overview of the different actually regions of the brain and their role and their function. So we have talked about the primitive brain, or the brain stem, which is involved in unconscious functions such as breathing, the heart rate, our blood pressure, and so on. So this is the region which actually control these portions of the brain, and this is very important for life, and it is very well protected actually at the center of the brain. This is called the brain stem. And cerebellum, as I mentioned, that is mainly involved in movement and coordination and the balance. So this is the hindbrain at the very back side of the brain. And then at the very end, this portion of the brain is actually the occipital lobe, which is involved in the vision process. So as I mentioned, that the information that are coming from our eyes that goes to the thalamus, that actually relays the information, the sense information, and goes to the VN and center of the brain that makes sense about the images we are seeing and make the perspective of everything. So this is the VN center of the brain, and then this is the emotions is the amygdala is there for the emotions, and then the memory processing is there that is involved, as he mentioned, that the hippocampus is there that is mainly involved in the memory related long-term memory, and then there is a occipital uh, lobe and that is involved in the BN. So that is the hearing, which is going from our ears to the thalamus, and then the hearing center of the brain. And this portion is involved in taste. This portion is our parietal lobe is for the touch, and then this is portion which is also involved in our motion movement control. Then this portion is involved in smell, speech, and this is the frontal lobe which is involved in attention seeking behavior, attention planning, decision making. So this is very important. That gives specific feature to the human. So this is a broader overview of the brain and the different functions and different portion and the functions of the brain. Here is the research, maybe very interesting for you, that the woman, there are like, first I would like to tell you that the human brain, the male brain is around 10% larger than the female brain because of the male and female structure ratio. So if we talk about the volume of the brain, male brain is larger than the female brain. But the other finding that is done by a huge studies in which they have scanned 46,000 brain images, and they have checked about the activity that is going on in the brain and what portions of the brain are active in different tasks and whose brain is more active. They compare the male brain with the female brain about the activities of the brain, and the research indicates that women have more active brain than men according to science. This is one of the very important study that is being done in United States, in which they analyze the brain and through the images, in which we can check the brain activity. And according to that research, female brain is more active, although it's smaller in size compared to the male, but it is more active because more things are going on. So as I often mention in my lectures that male actually focus on one of the things at a time. For example, I was giving a lecture in one of the university in Islamabad, and during the lecture, I mentioned about this research, and I was talking to the male audience first, and I was saying, okay, if you are like the male audience and I'm giving the lecture, you are mainly focusing on the content of the lecture, that what I am describing. And but if the female brain on the other side is actually more active. So they not only focusing on what information I'm giving to them, but they are also focusing that uh, my body, how are my body movements are going on, what color shirt I am wearing, uh, either I have a ring or not, and so on. So either I am wearing glasses or not, and so on. So female brain is more active. They process more. They are multitasking as compared to the male. So they actually they are they are multitasking and they are thinking in different ways as compared to the male brain. So they are a bit different. So this is the study that indicates that their brain is more active. So here is a quote from Nancy Gibbs, and that is I thought it is worth mentioning here, that the emotional life grows out of an area of the brain called the limbic system, specifically the amygdala. Whence come delight and disgust and fear and anger. So these are actually our all the emotions. They are from the limbic system, specifically the amygdala, as I mentioned. the lecture, which controls our emotions. And so that's our whole emotional behavior is actually governed by a small part in our brain that is called the amygdala, and our whole emotions are mainly based on that portion. So with this, thank you very much for your listening. I hope this will be interesting for you. And in this lecture, I have given a very brief overview about the brain structure and function, and we will discuss in detail about uh, different portion of the brain in our coming lectures, in which we will describe the neurons and how the neural circuits are formed in the brain, and how we can improve those neural circuits, how we can improve our learning experiences, and so on. And in addition, we will, in the coming lecture, we will discuss the techniques which are in which we actually study the brain. What are different techniques? So I think there are more than 10 techniques that I will describe about in which we study the brain and how we can study the brain from the cellular level to whole brain, and also how we study the brain activity. And this is also very important to mention that this is actually recently been done. All the scans that are being done, like functional MRI and the PET scan and so on. So these are the recently being introduced after the 2000 in the last 10, 15 years. And from that, we have got a lot of more information. As I was giving the introduction orientation session, that initially we were discussing about the learning experience on the basis of psychology. But presently, we are mainly focusing on the neurosciences. And now we can visualize what is actually, even during the lecture, how we can, what portion of brains are active. And recently I was watching a video from China in which they have put small sensors on the brain, and that gives a real-time data to the teacher that which student is concentrating and which student is not. And this is actually the experience that I have got during my stay in Japan. So we also used to wear a cap sort of structure in our brain, and that gives how much we are concentrating at a time, and it gives real-time data that how much you are focusing on something. And you can see that how the future education will be when you can in real time you can sense that whose brain is active, whose brain is not active, who is concentrating on information, who is not concentrating on information. So there is a lot of new things are coming, and we will describe some of the things in a broader perspective to you, so you can have a better teaching experience in your life. With this, thank you very much for watching this video. If you have any question, you can ask in the comments, or you can ask in our WhatsApp group that we have generated for this course. So you can ask question, or you can also ask a question individually. My email address is given. You can email me, or you can send me the question on WhatsApp, and I will try to answer those questions. So hopefully you will learn these things, and then we will give you assignments in coming lectures. So you also have to complete those assignments. Thank you very much.